Afternoon, welcome to this event hosted at the RSA. My great pleasure to welcome you all here. I'm Anthony Painter. I'm Director of the Independent Review into the Police Federation, which is housed here at the RSA. I'm also author of a book called Left Without a Future, Social Justice in Anxious Times. So I'm very interested in power, legitimacy and social justice. So looking forward very much to Professor Stein Ringen's talk this lunchtime. Before we begin, can I just ask you to make sure that your mobile phones are switched to silent. Please do tweet away using the hashtag RSA Ringen if you want to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. As usual, we're live streaming today's event, so welcome to all our web viewers. Now let's, having done the housekeeping, introduce our speakers. Professor Stein Ringen is Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Oxford and Adjunct Professor at Lillehammer University College in Norway. He's Visiting Professor at Richmond and the American International University in London. What you may not know, and he may not know either, he has a very special place in the RSA's history because he gave the first talk that was turned into an RSA Animate. So he fired the starting gun on the RSA Animate concept, which has been enjoyed by millions of people across the globe. Stein writes widely and influentially across political science, sociology, economics. His books include The Possibility of Politics, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Brown, and What Democracy is For. He joins us today to share his insights from his new book, Nation of Devils, Democratic Leadership and the Problem of Obedience. He's going to talk to us today about what is power. And takes a very different view from the conventional view of power, which is about the capacity to get things done. It's about basically the formal position, the vehicle that you get in to drive, then it's all down to the leader and how they ultimately create an argument, a movement, an ability to change. So that's a very different line on what we've traditionally understood power to be. So it's very interesting from that perspective. Now, to shed light on Professor Ringen's hunch about power, we're delighted to welcome Chris Huhne as our discussant today. Chris was formerly Liberal Democrat MP for Eastleigh and Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. He's currently Europe Chairman of Zilka Biomass Energy, consultant for Nationwide Energy Services, and he writes a weekly column for The Guardian, which you all may read from time to time. So the structure of today's session is that Stein will speak first for 20 minutes. Chris will provide some reflections on his talk. The three of us will have a little bit of a conversation, then we'll open it out to the audience and really get a good discussion go. So lots to discuss. Let's kick off. Please join me in welcoming Stein Ringen.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to speak in the RSA again. I'm delighted that Chris Huhne has agreed to participate in the discussion. He's a man who knows a bit about power from various perspectives. Power, say the political scientists, is the ability to get things done. That's the point of it. That's why politicians and parties compete for power and to get into power, because when you win power, you have in your hands that magic that enables you to get things done. And that's why we have this traditional view in Britain that governments should be strong, because they then have the power they need to get things done. That's the excuse for preserving a perverse election system, because for whatever its faults, it produces strong governments that then have the power they need. That's why there is this traditional view that Parliament should be weak and essentially serve to shore up the government, because that makes government strong and hence enables them to get things done. Well, that view is the one I will suggest is a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of power. And that misunderstanding about the nature of power is at the heart of the terrible predicament of misrule that has befallen Britain. So no, I say, power is not the ability to get things done. And one man who found that out was Charles I. And not only because he had his head cut off, but even before that he was a powerful king, but he, from his experience, observed that, quote, "There is more to the doing than bidding it be done." Power is at play when governors are up against others. The governor is the one who wants something done, and the others are those he depends on affecting to make that happen. So there are two types of power then: the power of governors over others and the power of others over governors. Power sits on both sides of the exchange and is not what governors bring to bear on others, but something that both sides bring to bear on each other. Governing, then, is not a matter of getting things done. It is always a matter of getting others to get things done. Always, others intervene. That gives them power. And the misunderstanding that I'm speaking about is to not fully grasp the powerful intervening agency of others. Now, the reason power is not the ability to get things done is that the distance from power to done is long, and that the space between the two is twisted and full of impediments on the governor that gives others power. The governor has the right to make decisions which others are supposed to act on, but again, there's more to the bidding, there's more to the doing than bidding it be done. There's more to it for three reasons. First, political decisions produce only inputs into getting things done. A government may, for example, increase the defense budget, but that still leaves open the question of what use the military will make of those additional means. Second, if things are eventually to happen, the decisions that start the process must be well made and the right ones. That depends on how good the decision makers are, both on how competent they are individually and on how well they collaborate, such as by avoiding infighting, fortress mentality, or groupthink. The power of office is a certificate to be the decision maker, but no more than a driving license says how good a driver the holder is, does power say how good a getter-done the decision maker is. It also depends, and crucially, on procedure. If the decision-making procedure is a mess, what comes out of it will be a mess. In fact, explains Katrin Schulz, I think she has spoken here in the RSA on a previous occasion, in a very fine book on what she calls wrongology. In decision-making, certainly political decision-making, things will go wrong if there are not orderly procedures in place to prevent it. And thirdly, inputs need to be processed further into outcomes. As power leads to inputs through decisions, inputs lead to outcomes through implementation. Effective implementation depends on administrative order, that administrators get the job done that is put to them, and on a culture of compliance in the population, so that underlings have enough trust in and confidence in their leaders to more or less do as they are told. In this long process, the power of the governor sits at the start and things happening at the end. And whether the governor has much or little power, what comes out at the end may be what he has intended, something else, something that doesn't work, something better, or nothing. Now, the power of others sit in the governor's dependency on the other for getting his decision pushed through to things happening at the end of the process. A minister, for example, is dependent both on his officials doing what he puts to them, and on people throughout the country complying. All these others have the power to go along with their minister or to subvert, disregard, work to rule, drag their feet, turn their backs, or refuse. And those the governor really depends on have as much power over him as he has over them. That's why, for example, the week before the Allied invasion of Iraq in 2003, the commander of the British forces, Admiral, later Lord Boyce, was able to demand an assurance from the Prime Minister that the war would be legal in international law. Behind that demand was a threat of not obeying the war order, and the Prime Minister was forced to give his commander, in writing, the assurance he demanded. So governors and others are up against each other. The governor can either command or he can persuade. The more power he can lean on, the more he can command. The more the power of others, the more he must rely on persuasion. Almost always, there are counterpowers. And once we grasp the powerful intervening agency of others, we see that governance is mainly a business of persuasion. Commanding is either impossible or counterproductive, and a good leader is one who knows the art of persuasion. Now, what makes people accept persuasion is not power, but authority, which is a very different commodity. A governor with authority can persuade reluctant others to go along with his wishes, or even make them think and believe that what he wants of them is really what they want too. And the authority of a governor is in the eyes of others, just as beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And when underlings see that spark of authority, it works wonders. If servants acknowledge their superiors as their lords, observed or said the observant Machiavelli, they bear natural affection for them. Authority is contained in the willingness of others to listen and be persuaded. No governor has any other authority than that which he is able to extract from others. Authority enables governors to get others to do for them, but at the same time, the governor is at the mercy of those same others for the authority he needs to lead them. The authority of a leader depends on his ability to trap reluctant others into seeing him as someone who deserves obedience. Authority, then, although appearing to belong to the governor, is really in the gift of those he wants to govern. The ultimate power of others, then, is their ability to deny the governor the authority he needs to be able to affect them. That kind of power, explained President Václav Havel of the Czech Republic, who, while still a dissident, made his great contribution to the theory of power in what he called the power of the powerless. The powerless may not be able to oppose visibly, but as long as the governor is in any way dependent on them, even they can subvert. Governing, then, is a power business, obviously, but never only a power business. It is also and always and mainly a people business. Now, I've spoken here in the RSA previously about misrule British style, about the experience of bad law, there is too much of it and too much that is badly prepared, and about the propensity in our public policies for things to go wrong. No one listens, of course, but that's not a reason to not obey, not repeat it. Recently, Anthony King and Ira Crew have published a book about the blunders of our governments, a book that shows that the going wrong is not the domain of any single government, but it is systemic. There are many reasons for this. Obviously, the blame for bad law must fall on Parliament, and in particular on the hapless House of Commons. That puts the stamp of law on just about any rubbish that the government puts before it. That's my agreement about procedure. That's my argument about procedure. We don't have proper lawmaking procedures in this country, and the outcome is as inevitable. But for now, I want to hone in on the misunderstanding about the nature of power. This misunderstanding is to overestimate what power can give you and to underestimate the degree to which governance is a people business. So let me take a couple of examples, and the first one being the bedroom tax, which is now coming in. Set aside whether or not it is well-intentioned. That's not what I want to discuss. This is a policy that is so badly designed that anyone with half an eye in his head can see that it will fail. It's tragic, by the way, that the relevant civil servants have not been able to prevent it, but probably they are so demoralized or depowered that they are content to see the government make a fool of itself. Having been a civil servant myself, I know that this is a real possibility. It's doomed to failure for two reasons. First, it puts an unbearable burden on the officials and social workers who are going to implement it. They are going to have to snoop around into people's homes and see what's under their duvets. They are going to hate the job. And when you have an army of officials who hate what they are told to do, they do not do it well. Most likely, they are going to help dependents to cheat on the policy. Secondly, it puts a terrible burden of compliance on dependents. The afflicted are supposed to move or pay a penalty. Most of them will have nowhere to move, and most of them cannot afford to pay. They will be tempted, forced to cheating, because rules have been imposed upon them which they will be unable to obey. A policy with little or no effect that, as a byproduct, creates unnecessary criminality. Now, this is a policy that relies entirely on command, both over officials and clients, and that is built on a disregard of the inescapable fact that a policy cannot work unless the relevant others are willing and able to implement it. Governments cannot get done anything they want just because they have power. They cannot do more than they are able to persuade others to go along with. It is no good resorting to command because commands don't work up against the powerful intervening agency of others. This policy and its failure is symptomatic of a relentless restructuring of welfare in this country over the years, which is one long, sad list of reforms on top of reforms that don't work. And for a second example, let me take the National Health Service. Now, we have in this country the best health service anywhere in the world, and the most appreciated one. Yet all we are hearing these days is about problems and crisis. Often, we are told that it is underfunded, but that is not the case. The NHS is awash with money. During the last government, by 2007, 2008, the NHS budget was lifted to an unprecedented level from about 5 to about 7 or 8% of national income. The NHS has never had more money to work with than it has now. However, during the period of increased funding, there was also a collapse, and that's not too strong a word, of productivity in the NHS. We know that because it has been measured. The NHS is a big corporation, big enough to be observable in national accounts, and those accounts show that while more money was going in, less output was coming out per pound. It's been analyzed, this data has been analyzed by the excellent Institute for Fiscal Studies and is crystal clear. So why did productivity collapse as more money went in? Well, there were two reasons for that. First, one reason for the excellence of the NHS is that it has been not only good, but very cheap. It has been cheap because it has worked under very strict budget discipline. When the new money went in, it went in too quickly and with too much careless political spin. And the result was that budget discipline broke down throughout the system. For example, 4 out of every 10 pounds of new money, 4 out of every 10 pounds of new money was siphoned off in a pay bonanza for existing staff. And the second reason was that those working in the NHS were subjected to a dictatorship of rules, targets, form filling, and box ticking. And all this was a conspicuous display from above of a lack of confidence in NHS workers. And those workers reacted, as workers do in such circumstances, by silent revolt. Others, I have said, have the power to subvert, to disregard, to work to rule, to drag their feet, turn their backs, refuse. And that's exactly what happened in the NHS. As a result, very little of what went into the NHS came as inputs on one side, came out again as additional outputs on the other side. This is measured also and is well known. No doubt the NHS needed more investment, and the British people were happy to pay it. But the way it was done was a disaster, and counts, in my opinion, as one of the great tragedies in British public policy. We see the legacy now in the litany of complaints over how a brilliant service for the British people is underperforming and meeting with dissatisfaction. It is obvious to me that the explanation was an overestimation of power and a neglect of governance as a people business. What the NHS is a gigantic organization of people. If it is to perform, its people must do it. If they are not encouraged and persuaded, they won't. If they are commanded and pushed around, they will revolt. No government, however powerful, can get more out of the NHS than it is able to animate the people who work in it to put their backs into producing. It's people business, and the NHS is suffering from a neglect over many years of the people business aspect of management, and from the misunderstanding in one government after the other that they can use their power to command the NHS to efficiency. I'm wrapping up now. Now, this overestimation of power is a result of the excessive centralization of political power in the British system. And the result of that centralization is inevitably a command and control style of management. It just isn't possible to manage a country of 60+ million people from a few offices in Whitehall. When you try to do that, the only instrument left to you is to command, and you deny yourself the ability to persuade. In this case, the more power to the government, the less its ability to get things done. And we see that impossibility in the examples I have given. It's not about this or that government. it's systemic. It is not the NHS that needs to be reorganized, which is done again and again to disastrous effect. It is the system that manages the NHS and other public policies that need to be reorganized. It needs to be decentralized in respect for the powerful intervening agency of others. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. Chris, as a participant in a governance system that sort of consistently produces misrule, what was your reaction to that?
Well, I have a difficulty in that I agree with a very great amount of what Stein argues, both today and in the book, which is well worth reading, by the way. And particularly, there is a sort of sense that I think anybody who's been in a position of power rapidly discovers, which is that wherever it is, it's not where you are. Power is always elsewhere. And I think Jonathan Powell described it as the sort of crock of gold. You know, it's the end of the rainbow, but you never actually get there. And there are a couple of very good quotes which Stein has dug out. One was from President Harry Truman, who was commenting on handing over power to his successor, who was, of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been used to exercising enormous power in a totally command and control environment as the commander-in-chief in the Second World War. And he said, Truman said, poor Ike, he'll sit right here in the Oval Office. He'll sit right here and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. It won't be a bit like the army. And Jonathan Powell, who was Tony Blair's chief of staff, said, a new prime minister pulls all the levers of power and nothing happens. And we have an idea about power, and a lot of people who seek power and achieve it have an idea of power which is almost an engineer's view of power. You're sort of sitting in the signal box, and all you have to do is pull the lever, and the points will then change, and the train will go off in a different direction. But actually, I think Stein's absolutely right, that if you are exercising power about complex decisions, and that's an important qualification, then you have to do so by mobilizing people and motivating people. And it's really a set of leadership skills which is quite similar to the problems that many people find actually running any big organization, which is that you actually need to get people on side and sharing the goals. So one thing I think which is worth pointing out is that there are some good examples in our history of where power has clearly been exercised effectively and quickly. The creation of the National Health Service in the 45-51 government, the enormous housing program in the 1950s, which we're probably going to need again, but I mean a housing program which really built enormous numbers of homes for people through that period. And where, you know, there were, when Churchill appointed Macmillan as the housing minister, he said, you know, this is either going to make you or break you, because if you succeed in this, everybody will think you're marvelous, and if you don't, you know, that's it. And it was a massive implementation task. And perhaps a final example is the motivation and mobilization through all-out war, both the First World War and the Second World War. And what all of those examples that I give have in common is that it was very obvious to all but the most curmudgeonly of our fellow citizens that actually this was an overwhelming social national objective. There weren't many people who were railing against by the time it happened, except some of the vested interests within the medical profession, the NHS, or the housing program, or winning the war against Hitler. So as a politician attempting to exercise power, the easiest job is to have something where there's a massive social consensus in favor of the objectives that you're trying to achieve, because that effectively does a lot of the job for you. In reality, in the sort of democracies and the sort of decisions that most of us have to deal with today, Things are much more complex. There are vested interests who are quite capable of turning around and saying, 95% certainty that climate change is actually man-made? What absolute nonsense. In fact, that means, we were going to ignore this issue. Or we had exactly the same thing when governments attempted to introduce curbs on smoking. Sir Richard Doll, what does he know about it? Lung cancer could come from all sorts of causes. Scientists who are being funded by Imperial Tobacco and BAT and so forth. So there's all of that complexity to deal with. And the more complex the decisions, the more complex and where the objectives don't have that overwhelming social consensus, then I think you need to use all your skill, not just to pull the lever, because that gets you very, very short way, but actually to mobilize a whole set of support. And I think that Stein is absolutely right to quote what happened with the NHS, throwing money at the problem. I mean, I think money is often a necessary condition of solving problems, but it certainly isn't a sufficient one. And if you throw money at problem, particularly by raising lots of pay, the GP contract was a classic example of that under the last government, and at the same time, the subtext of your approach to throwing all that money at people is to say, well, actually, we don't really trust you. We're going to run a system here where every one of your professional judgments is going to be cross-questioned, and there's going to be a reporting mechanism, and we're going to undermine a lot of what you have traditionally taken pride in. Then you're going to have a problem. So I think that is absolutely right. I would merely add that there's another category of issues which I think are a real problem in modern government, and that is where the problem doesn't sit in one handy box marked the Ministry of Defence, the Home Office, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, where they actually cut across. And there are lots and lots of problems like that. Climate change being an obvious one. You cannot conceivably deal with climate change without handling the energy system, but you also need to handle transport. You also need, it's an educational role. You also need the Foreign Office, because the Foreign Office is involved with international treaty making. You need the Treasury, because you can't do anything without the Treasury if you can spend money. So it is a cross-Whitehall. It's probably a problem that actually is the biggest cross-Whitehall problem since wartime, and you need people to work together and not have this sort of not invented here syndrome. But it can work at a very small level as well. As a constituency MP, I remember dealing with antisocial behaviour problems where neighbours would come and complain about a problem family. And inevitably, that problem family would be being dealt with by probably the police, environmental health of the local council, who were responsible for monitoring how much noise they were making, the social services, who would probably be worried about one of the children and maybe, or more of the children, and thinking about what should be happening there, education service, because the kids would probably not be turning up at school, the housing association, because they might well be social tenants. And getting all of those agencies to actually talk to each other and come up with a plan for dealing with this, which there is now happening through the Problem Families Initiative. But actually, that was a classic example of something falling outside all the usual silos, and where you desperately needed to make sure that there was sort of cross-disciplinary working. Another very good example, crime, violent crime, and the policing of violent crime, and the National Health Service. A splendid specialist at Cardiff University who did a lot of, I'm not allowed to call it cosmetic surgery because it isn't, it's more fundamental when people are damaged after violent incidents, said, well, why on earth?
Restorative surgery.
It's more than that. It's maxillofacial. There's a long bit of jargon which I can't remember. But he basically said, why can't we supply, as the NHS, as the Accident and Emergency Department, the data about where these incidents are actually happening to the police, so that the police can, anonymized, no patient is going to have their name handed across, but the data about where these incidents are repeatedly cropping up can be handed over to the police, and the police can then police these hot spots. And it works. It really does work. But it is still the case that fewer than half of hospitals and police areas are actually cooperating in this way. And yet there's a classic example of how you can get a dramatic reduction in violent crime and, of course, a reduction in the pressure on the National Health Service if you operate to try and stop the problem ahead of time. So I think all of those things are right. Complexity is tremendously challenging, and the people business, the more different people with different professional expertise are involved, the more important Stein's message about motivating them and getting them to share your organizational goals actually is. Just one final point, if I may, and that's on the issue of parliamentary democracy. I mean, the reality is we have had, as Lord Hailsham famously said, an elective dictatorship for some time. Richard Crossman, of course, in the 1960s, and I was subjected to this as a student of politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford in the early 1970s, Crossman argued that we had prime ministerial government. And we do have enormously prime ministerial government, except, of course, that increasingly these enormously prime ministerial or presidential prime ministers recognize that it's very difficult to pull the lever and deliver the sort of changes that they want. And so maybe we do need to rethink the relationship, I think, between that exceptionally powerful, potentially powerful office of Prime Minister and the legislature. Maybe we should directly elect the Prime Minister at the same time that we elect Parliament, so that there is actually you have two votes. You have one vote for your MP, and you have at the same time another vote for who is going to be the Prime Minister. And that would separate out the executive from what ought to be the legislature, and maybe the people who were being elected to the legislature would then be less keen merely to ingratiate themselves with their party leaders so that they became ministers, and more keen to do what I think is a very important job, which is actually holding the executive to account. There is an issue there because, of course, Stein in his book also finds the dysfunctionality of the US system a real problem. And if you set up great checks and balances, you occasionally get quite dysfunctional outcomes. But I do think that, that when it works, that system is much, much better than the system that we have at the moment. And particularly as we discover in recent weeks, certainly it was the case, I know, that we did not know in the Cabinet or in the National Security Council what GCHQ was doing with the tempora system. And we still don't know who authorized that. We don't know which Prime Minister and which Foreign Secretary actually authorized those decisions. So that's a very good example of Parliament not holding the executive to account at all.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Right. When I was reading your book, one thing that struck me, you'd have to be completely and utterly insane to want to try and acquire political power and become a political leader. And in some respects, your book is a kind of a self-help manual for aspiring politicians. But that was one thing. But the second thing that sprung to mind, there is another quote about power which has always stuck with me, and it's actually from Lyndon Johnson. And he describes power in the following way, that power is where power goes. So a Johnson, a Bismarck, a Caesar may well have seen themselves as creators of power rather than occupiers of power. And do you think that your notion of power in that sense might be too static, and actually it's something that actually is a bit more dynamic than that, as evidenced by the participants in the power game themselves? Now, having said that, Johnson, of course, used power for good and ill.
Right, well, let me just make a couple of comments, and thank you both for saying some kind words about my book. Did you mention that it's on sale outside the door?
It's coming. It's coming. Signed copies and all the rest of it.
At a generous discount? No, that's mentioned. Let me say, I'm mad about wanting to be a leader. I think that's right. And I have a litany of that in the book. What if you want to make yourself the leader, the prime minister or the president, you give up everything.
Yeah.
If you can't do that, and I'll illustrate that. I don't know if you remember the day that Gordon Brown left office.
I do.
And he walked in front of the cameras in front of 10 Downing Street with his wife and their 2 children in hand. And I remember I saw this, and tears came to my eyes. I was so emotional. And then the question I asked myself, why has this man never shown anything of his person to us before?
Yes.
I mean, not necessarily parading his children and so on, but why? Well,
you were emotional. He looked happy, by the way.
He looked happy, but he was happy, of course, because his 3 years as prime minister had been a misery.
Yeah.
And there he was, and we, for the first time, the day he left Downing Street, we saw something of his person.
Yeah.
Now, by dynamic, I don't know if it's dynamic, static. I mean, one example here is Tony Blair, whose premiership has interested me enormously. He started with just, tons of authority, which gradually was ground down, by spin and bad policies and just wear and tear, so that, by the time he left office, there was none left, and it hasn't been restored. So it has to be maintained. So I'm aware of those dynamics. Then I wanted to make one comment on parliamentary democracy and the relationship between the executive and Parliament in Britain. Because there's been a very notable improvement. It's a great thing happened in Parliament in the last few years, and that is the work of the standing committees, the select committees, in their scrutiny of public policy. They become much more energetic, forceful, strong, independent, and they do excellent scrutiny of public policy. We hear it, by the way, on the morning news, twice a week, and what we then hear are reports about how bad things work. But anyway, they're looking at it. But they are not doing scrutiny pre-legislation. They're doing scrutiny after the fact, once policies have been put into effect and work. But there is, in our Parliament, compared to almost anywhere else you see a legislature, almost no work done in Parliament on the legislation that comes from government. Well, almost no is maybe an exaggeration, but there is no proper pre-legislation scrutiny in Parliament of the legislation that is put to them, which is why I said that the Parliament puts the stamp on anything of law, on anything the government brings to them. And because in all decision-making, certainly political decision-making, what is good is what is tested. It needs to be tested. And then what is not good needs to be got out of the way. And it's only when decisions are tested and when the decision-maker knows that they will be tested that in the end you can have any hope of good decision-making. So Chris, I think on the parliamentary side, I have a recommendation for reforms of the British system here. Of course I do. Actually, I presented it here in the RAS previously, but as you know, no one listens. One of the recommendations is a change in the working procedures of Parliament so that proper committee scrutiny of legislation is put into effect of all matters that come to Parliament. Laws, budget. The amount of work that Parliament does on the budget is it's astonishing. The government comes to...
Astonishingly little.
Yeah, comes, here's the budget, and it's the most important thing Parliament does, put its stamp on the budget, and they almost don't look at it. So, pre-legislation scrutiny, which would be a great improvement in the British system.
There is some already, in the sense that, for example, the bill on that Theresa May was pushing on the Communications Data Bill was subjected to pre-legislative scrutiny by a joint committee of both houses. Okay. And actually that did effectively, during that process, it stalled it, but it's not regular.
I'll cut it, but I'll just say it's at the government's discretion what legislation is to be subjected to pre-legislation.
Okay, I think we'll pause this at that moment now, because I'm very conscious that there'll be people in the audience who want to ask a question. If you could keep your questions relatively short, and I'll try and take a mix from around the room. That gentleman at the back there, I'll take it in threes. At the front here. No, but you're going to wait then. This gentleman in the middle and this lady at the front. So, gentleman at the back first.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name's Andrew Armour. I'm a fellow of the RSA and a marketing consultant. So, my question, I realise the conversation today has been about political power, but I'd like the panel's view on actually commercial power, because in view of the fact that people like Samsung employ 80,000 people just in research and development, that Apple has, I think, $500 billion in investments. So how has the shift of power changed from politics to the private enterprise, in particular people like media, celebrities and corporations?
Thank you. Lady at the front.
Claire O'Connor. I'd like to hear from the panel an example of success. You talked about the NHS, bedroom tax. From the last couple of decades, a public policy that has worked well because it's mobilised the masses.
Okay, I think it was the gentleman in the middle there.
Stephen Adamson. When it comes to political power, do you think one of the problems here is our oppositional system, whereby every parliamentary decision is a football match, but the government always has far more players, so they're going to win? And you quoted the problems in America, where it seems to be even greater, that you just have two sides that are sort of never going to agree with each other and do what they can to disrupt each other.
Okay. Very, very, very quickly, I want to bring Chris in on this commercial power question, because obviously in energy and climate change, this is a very significant consideration, and also a public policy success.
Well, on commercial power, I don't think that the relative position of big businesses and governments has changed dramatically. I mean, what has changed is that we are a bit more aware in this country and in Europe in general of the need to tackle excessive concentrations of commercial power in a way that the Americans always were. I mean, the Sherman Acts breaking up Standard Oil, for example, were something that no European country was doing. And I think that in the end, the public sector, if it is mobilized, the government, if it's mobilized, has so much more leverage, not least, of course, the ability to pass legislation that private companies don't have. What is true is that R&D in terms of new technology is racing away. The technological pace of change is racing away. And because government tends to be a relatively slow system, it's finding it harder to keep up with some of the developments, which is partly what's been happening about GCHQ. But I don't fundamentally think that the relationship between commercial power and political power has changed. It is about dealing with abuses on both sides, potentially. Examples of success, the first one that came into my head was the drink driving campaign, where actually I think it's a rather good example of what Stein is talking about. It was a whole mixture of legislative change, but also leading change in social attitudes. When I was a student, people would still regularly, particularly the older generation, say, "Have one for the road." You haven't heard that for a while, have you? And I think that there's been an enormous change there, and it's a change which has come about through social attitudes, through legislation, through a whole set of things. So that would be one example. I mean, I'm sure there are many others.
Stein, does the adversarial oppositional nature of the British political system impair good policy, good governance? And is commercial power something that's fundamentally different from political power, or is it just within the broad set?
Well, I think the exercise of power in corporations is very much like the exercise of power in government. So there again, the ability to persuade, to mobilize, is very much the same. I think it goes down to relatively small organizations. I think a good teacher, for example, is someone who is able to mobilize the pupils and to get them involved rather than to tell them. It's not enough. So I think the exercise of power is very much the same on both sides. Whether there is a shift, I think in one respect there is, and I'll just mention it, but I can't go into the deep explanation of this, and that is that, well, in the book and in general, I think the ability of governments to rule well depends very much on their power to tax. That is really the central issue for a government, to be able to extract enough money in an acceptable way from its population. And that power, that ability, is reduced by globalization and the increasing power of corporations that globalization has rendered. So there is a shift in power, and we see the difficulty of taxing very strongly from one government to another. The oppositional system, I mean, I sometimes look or listen to the Prime Minister's questions in Parliament. You know, and I think to myself, if the Prime Minister should be so perverse that he went home one evening and looked again at himself, he must feel that this is ridiculous. I mean, that is, you know, two grown men who stand up and shout at each other.
By the way, Simon, we already know they're mad because they've gone into political leadership. So
that display is ridiculous. And I mean, anyone who steps back and has a look at it must see that this is just sort of a modern form of cockfighting.
Okay, thank you.
Successes, I was racking my brains for that. It's not so easy to find, but I'll mention two. One in Britain is 5 a day. You know, the recommendation that came from an official committee, government committee on nutrition. Now, 5 a day has become standard as a part of our language. We speak to each other about 5 a day. And it was a fantastic example of the ability to govern well with good encouragements. Yeah. It's worked. The other big example that is often mentioned is Finland, where the country turned itself around from a situation of very bad public health with enormously high cancer rates and so on because of bad lifestyles and bad nutrition. And in a 20-year period, through systemic work led by the government, the country turned itself around and solved that problem. Fantastic example of government success.
Okay, Stein, I'm going to take one more bank of questions, I think, because I think that's what we're going to have time for. At the front here, because we've got some questions coming in over Twitter, so we'll take those. And then we'll go to the gentleman right at the back, and the gentleman with the glasses here at the front.
As I said, I've got two questions. One from Michael King. He asks, Michel Foucault said power's success is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms. So the question is power exposed today, or is it still hidden? And a second question from Jonathan Algar, and this is for Chris Hoon in particular. Problems are increasingly cross-departmental. Thus, is the current ministerial model fit for purpose, or would it be more fitting, for example, to have ministers aligned and accountable to big projects rather than specific departments? Okay. That was 2 tweets.
Thank you. Yeah.
Ben Harvey, Fellow. My question is this a bigger, more systemic problem of mass disengagement, that we're not conditioned from a very early age, that we have a responsibility as an individual to participate in the process? And growing up, you just think it's too big, I'm not going to have an impact, so therefore I will disengage, especially in countries like the UK and US where you don't have to vote.
Thank you.
I agree with Stein's views that the exercise of power in very large commercial organisations is quite similar to that of the exercise of power in government. In almost all large commercial organisations, by the time people assume positions of senior leadership, they have a great deal of experience and training to enable them to exercise power, I think in the way you suggest,
What's your question?
My question is, do you think that is the case within government? And if it isn't, what can be done to rectify it?
Right, as we've got 2 minutes each to answer the very narrow range of issues.
I'll leave aside the Foucault stuff. I'm not sure.
Wise.
I think that may apply to less complex and developed societies than ours. And in simple societies, certainly, I think the monarch liked to be able to sort of be a deus ex machina. I'm not sure that works any longer. On the cross-departmental front, yes, I think that there has to be a way of dealing with particular problems and dealing with it in a cross-departmental way. The Cabinet committee structure is set up to do that, but what the Cabinet committee structure rarely does is chase through on projects through to implementation. They're very good for sorting out differences between colleagues on the policy, but actually the implementation is absolutely crucial. And the only bit of chasing through on implementation that Cabinet committees, in my experience, tend to do is when we're actually in the middle of a war, as we were briefly, in my experience, on Libya. And then, the National Security Committee on Libya met every day. And I think some of these problems, particularly the economic problems, housing and things like that, we do need to have at least monthly cabinet meetings where you are looking at following through on a series of objectives which different departments are responsible for. On mass disengagement, I don't believe that. Successive generations politically have always said that it's the end of the world, people don't have any civic culture, etc., etc. There was the famous Oxford Union debate just before the Second World War, in which Hitler was meant to have made his judgment that the British wouldn't fight because the Oxford Union debate had concluded that they weren't going to fight for their country. Well, we found out pretty short order that wasn't the case. So I think that the death of civic culture is much overstated. I think we do, as we get bigger, have a problem, and I think Stein is again absolutely right to stress localism, because it's a key building block of successful democracies.
Thank you,
and in
Chris.
this country particularly, we have a problem.
Thank you. Stein, final word.
Well, I think this question of the exercise of government and whether, you see, my view now that Parliament is as unpopular as it is that the people in Parliament are fine. The problem is not that the wrong people are there. I don't even believe that the problem is of changing government from one to another. It's not that the wrong people are there. It's more systemic. And one of the issues in the exercise of government, again, is that there aren't good procedures. There aren't procedures that test decisions. There isn't adequate civil service autonomy, which is a great British tradition, which from Margaret Thatcher on has been destroyed. There isn't a culture of cabinet government, in spite of improvements having been made by the coalition. The coalition, I think, in my view, was an improvement in the British system, or it might have been. And in order to illustrate the importance of procedure here, I'll end up by going back to Churchill as an example, the greatest political leaders in Britain. Now, the fact is that as a manager, he was a disaster. If we read his biographies about him, he was hopeless. He had very hairy ideas about what should be done here, there, and everywhere. But this was at a time and in a situation where his top officials, were able to shoot down the ideas that were bad. And there's a marvelous book about this by Andrew Roberts called Masters and Commanders, about how the war effort was taken forward to great success in spite of, not because of, Churchill's management. So he was a animating, persuading leader, not a commanding leader, and we tried to command, he was generally wrong, but there was a system in place that prevented his wrong commands from being carried through. And that was a great blessing, and I'd like to see a bit more of that kind of system restored through proper cabinet government and proper civil service
Okay, Stein,
autonomy.
unfortunately,
That's it.
We're out of time now. It's always a good sign, I think, when you want to carry on after 2 o'clock, but it is 2 o'clock, and I know you all have places to go. Stein Ringen's book, Nation of Devils, is available for purchase at a discount, signed by the author, right outside this room. Thank you all. Thank you for your questions. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to Stein Ringen for an excellent book and an excellent presentation today. And thank you, Christine, for an excellent response. See you very soon at the RSA. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry I kept cutting you off.